Hello, my name is Jen Pedalston, and I am presenting today a recording of the program that was presented by the Chestermere Historical Foundation on February 16, 2021, titled The Lake and How It Came to Be. The Chestermere Historical Foundation acknowledges and is appreciative of the fact that this historical program is being delivered on the traditional land and home of the people of Treaty 7, the first 5 nations, the Siksika, Blackfoot, the Kainai, Blood, the Piikani, Pagan, the Stoney Nakoda, and Tsuut'ina Sarsi, and also we are on the home of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. This will be an outline of what we're presenting today. First of all, we need to go back to the 1800s. Canada was about to undergo confederation, and the Hudson's Bay Company monopoly was ending. And there was no unbiased evaluation of what at that time was called Rupert's Land, the part of Canada that goes from the Pacific coast to Manitoba, and was named for the first Hudson's Bay governor. So then we have John Palliser stepping into Canadian history and providing information on that area, eventually being useful to the CPR in the decision to build an irrigation system, which we're talking about today. We then have Confederation, and then in steps William Pierce, a committed Canadian, a prairie man, and the highest ranking government official west of Winnipeg. He became to be called the father of irrigation, and also was author of the Northwest Irrigation Act. So he leaves his position with the Canadian government and spearheads with J.S. Dennis the building of the Bow River Irrigation Project with the railway. And the western section of this project involved the Bow River, a dam, a balancing pond for the system, which happened to be on Kinniburg Slough, and voila, we have Chestermere Lake, an oasis in the prairies. And this slide is a picture that's a favorite of mine. It's my family out at our cabin at Chestermere Lake. So my family farmed east of Strathmore, and my dad, Bill Morgan, and my great uncle, Hugh Barry, were both on the WID board at different times, and our family owned irrigated land, and we were early adopters of that option from the WID to lease a property on Chestermere Lake. So we had a weekend getaway. My mom was in the hat in the middle. She was the life of most of the weekends we spent there. And my future husband, Bill, is peeking in from the left. And we still live on this property. Taking back Rupert's Land. Well, little impartial information was available on this area that was not prejudiced either for or against the Hudson's Bay, and then not all the information was available to the British or Canadian governments. And the agreement between the Hudson's Bay Company, which was managing Rupert's Land, British North America, that part of British North America, was to end in 1869. And Britain wanted to assess the land west of Winnipeg to the Pacific. So a wealthy Irishman, Sir John Palliser, was sent out by Britain to survey and describe this land between 1857 and 1861. And he went with a party of others to help him in that effort. So this man was chosen on 18th of December, 1856 by the Royal Geographical Society of England. And he was to set out with his company for 2 or more years with 3 tasks. Find a canoe route to Lake Superior, from Lake Superior to Red River, to report on the southern plains, and that's the area we're talking about today. To find the passes through the Rocky Mountains was his 3rd task. An explorer at heart, this 30-year-old, rich, educated Irishman had got prairie fever, according to one of his authors of his life story. He'd spent a year on the upper Missouri, on the plains there, and became an accomplished buffalo hunter. He had good experience working with indigenous people in the area. And rather than a picture of him in a uniform, I chose this one of a drawing done a watercolor drawing by his sister Mary, which shows him in the kind of clothing and maybe in more of a picture of what we can imagine him out on the western plains of Canada. So he was not a trained scientist and may have lacked some of the rigid precision in observations, but he had experience as a man who traveled on the plains, was able to live out there successfully, interacting with indigenous people, and he also spoke French, which would be of use with the Métis guides. He was a man of great strength and endurance, lusty, indomitable good humor, it's said, breezy geniality, warm-hearted friendliness, and generous in acknowledging the contributions of others in his report, which was probably a very important characteristic. He was independent from the Hudson's Bay Company, but still had the necessary experience. He was accompanied by, in his company of men, astronomer Thomas Blakiston, and there's a mountain in Waterton named after Thomas, botanist Eugene Bourgeot. We have Mount Bourgeot, which is near the Sunshine Ski Hill, and geologist James Hector, and he has his name on Mount Hector and also Kicking Horse Pass because Hector's pack horse injured him very severely, and while he was lying there for dead and they were digging his grave, he came to. So the river and the pass were named for that obstreperous horse. There were no end of difficulties on this trip. Arriving in Red River to set off to investigate the plains, he found that his guide, Boucherville, with whom he had traveled before, had been killed by Sioux warriors. Pallis's instructions insisted that he avoid any trouble with the indigenous peoples. And as well, the indigenous and Métis guides were very nervous of penetrating west into the country of the Sioux, Blackfeet, Pagans, and Plains Assiniboine, and this meant many diversions as they headed west. And if you see a map of his actual trips, you can see that they went back and forth many times, particularly from their bases, one of which was in Edmonton. Food was scarce, pasture was scarce for their horses, and then, of course, they had to deal in the summer with the mosquitoes and flies. They spent 2 winters in the west, and believe it or not, Palliser held a ball at Fort Edmonton the winter he spent there. And as we said, he was a lusty, jolly fellow and a man of open nature, so why not have a party while you're having a winter in Edmonton? So despite all of this, he did file his report in 1861, and the part of that report that we're interested in for this story is the dry area on which he reported that actually ended up being called Palliser's Triangle, and you can see that on the map in the dark orange area. And this is a copy of his report, which was presented to Parliament in Britain. So now let's talk about the railway. Well, in 1881, the Government of Canada began the unification of the country by building a transcontinental railway. This had been a big decision to make sure that the whole of Canada was united because there were some worries. Would the encroaching spirit of the United States swallow up the prairies of British North America as it had Oregon Territory? So the government considered that it would be necessary to set aside in excess of about 50 million acres. An agreement was reached with the CPR to build the railway in exchange for $25 million, which would be about 625 in today's dollars, in credit from the Canadian government, and a grant of 25 million acres of arable land. And that would be in the what would be now Crown land in the province of Alberta, or a province of Manitoba, and that part of the Northwest Territories we now know as Saskatchewan and Alberta. The track setting record for this, the train going through near Chestermere, was set in Strathmore on July 28th with 6.38 miles in one day. The CPR came through Calgary later that year. And this railway went through Palliser's Triangle. So here's a map of that route. You can see the CPR railway going along on the bottom line of the map. And you can see sort of faintly above and below that some pink hatching. And that was the land that would be given to the CPR in exchange for building the railway. But there were some doubters about whether all of this was going to work or not in terms of people being able to settle in that land along the railway. According to John Palliser in his report, it was desert or semi-desert in character and can never be expected to be occupied by settlers. It's the most arid region of the southern Canadian prairies. The grassland has a moisture deficit, meaning the transpiration exceeds the precipitation. So the CPR promoted dryland farming techniques to the settlers and tried very hard to educate and help the farmers be able to use this land, possibly because many of the settlers did not come from places that were dry. They came from Northern Europe and other places, and they were used to having enough rainfall so that they could grow their crops. So promoting irrigation seemed rather contrary to the main idea of promoting this dryland farming. And politicians and settlers did not really know much about irrigation at all. And this is a sample of one of the brochures that would have been handed out to encourage dryland farming and settling in the West. So, as I said, turning to promoting irrigation seemed at odds with this program that had been used by the CPR. So there was some resistance to this because, of course, there was talk about irrigation in this area based on the fact that other dry areas, such as down in the United States and Utah, had turned to irrigation. So enter William Pierce. Pierce was born in 1848 in Ontario. He died in 1930 in Calgary. But he was born and raised in Ontario and spent a lot of time clearing the family land on the north shore of Lake Erie. He loved to be in the outdoors and really enjoyed that kind of work. So when he went to university to train, he dropped out. He eventually got a job as a surveyor, and that really suited him. He was an adventurer and a dreamer. So in this job as surveyor, he did very well and eventually rose to become hired by the Canadian Department of Interior and became the superintendent of mines of the Northwest Territories. He moved to Calgary in 1887. He loved Calgary. He just really embraced the prairies and the city. He had visited the Mormons, of course, in Colorado and Utah as part of his work. And he got very excited about irrigation for Western Canada, where he was living. He was at that time the highest government official from Winnipeg to the Rockies. So this is a picture of William Pierce from the Glenbow, and also a picture of his wife, Margaret. Margaret's probably standing on the steps of their home in Calgary. And that home was called Bow Bend Shack. That shack, not a shack by the looks of it, of course, a beautiful sandstone house, was located on the point of some land that juts out into the Bow River, just where it bends. And you can see that bend from Memorial Drive looking south and from driving in from Forest Lawn into downtown as you cross the bridge and look north. The land was donated by the Pierce family in 1930 to Calgary, and it's now Pierce Estate wetland. What is sad is that the house was torn down in 1957 to make way for a Simpson Sears warehouse. But William Pierce was a believer. As we stated, he'd seen irrigation working, and he reported the value of irrigation in his reports in both 1885 and 1889 in his job with the Department of the Interior. He would quote Herodotus saying, "Egypt is the gift of the river, and that watering these dry lands creates fertility and thus prosperity for the people living there." So in desperation, he decided to create his own irrigation company. And that was the Calgary Irrigation Company. He got permission to take water from the Elbow River south of Calgary. But he ran into trouble getting investors for his company. He had wanted to run the company sort of behind the scenes. but it didn't work out very well. He really had trouble making that work. So he ended up being very involved in the company and was accused of mixing his government work with this private business. However, he forged ahead. But when a dispute happened on the Elbow River between the Springbank Irrigation Company and the Calgary Irrigation Company over water rights, it hit the newspapers. And both the Calgary Tribune and the Calgary Herald both had vitriolic editorials sent in discussing his work as where he was mixing causes, and also the dispute with the Springbank Irrigation Company. It was eventually, though, resolved, and they decided to share the rights based on acreage. The cyclical nature of wet and drought years was becoming obvious in this area. There was a drought from 1885 to 1896, and during that time, Pierce started to have the ear of the government and other people, including the CPR. And the success of the company, the Calgary Irrigation Company, did have some impact. People such as the Canadian Pacific Railway were looking at that. The larger corporations might be now willing to purchase irrigated lands when the price was low and construct irrigation works on the lands. So much of the credit of educating the public and making the West aware of irrigation farming methods belongs to Pierce and his Calgary Irrigation Company. Mm-hmm. Okay, so William Pierce, he's the believer. So because Pierce had had that experience of knowing about irrigation and traveling down to Utah, the government was interested because they wanted to ensure that the water rights in Canada belonged to the government. So they needed to have legislation for that. So Pierce was set with writing the technical details of the act, and it was supposed to be presented to the Canadian Parliament in February of 1894, but it was delayed. So that worried Pierce, as in Australia, a similar act to suppress riparian rights was argued for 28 days. However, people such as Richard Pilling, who had taken out a license to use water on the St. Mary's River, and Ora Card, who had done the same, both had the ear of the Prime Minister with their irrigation success along the St. Mary's River. And as Pierce said, fortune favored them. It turned out that on July 23rd, 1894, it was the hottest day anyone could remember in Ottawa. And there weren't very many members in attendance, enough to pass it, and those that were there just didn't have enough energy to discuss it. So the act provided for detailed surveys to be made of all arid regions. The Department of the Interior set up an irrigation branch under J.S. Dennis, who was put in charge of licensing and surveying. The act, so now all water belonged to the Crown. And this would mean that irrigation projects would be much easier because in the United States, the experience had been very difficult when water was privately owned. So both Pierce and Dennis were idealists and believed that a hamlet system, which is what had been used in Utah, would be the ideal way to bring prosperity along with irrigation. A central area with services such as a creamery, mills, institutions like schools would be in the center of what would be a shape like a wheel, with these places being in the axle area and farms radiating outward along the spokes with an irrigated core in that farming area and pasture land further out. And through the middle of this would travel a main irrigation canal with water for the farms to use. Later, A.S. Dawson, who became the chief engineer of the western section, which we'll talk about a bit later, expressed a similar sentiment to what Dennis and Pierce believed. Here's the quote: "Irrigation compels cooperative social organization, quite different from and far in advance of that necessary in humid countries. Irrigation is conducive to the preservation and development of the arts of peace, which means civilization." So as well, Mr. Pierce, in his idealism, had also worked along with Van Horn, the CPR president, to start Banff National Park. From steel to water. So with a good deal of behind-the-scenes work of William Pierce, who was now Chief Inspector of Surveys under Dennis, the CPR became convinced of the economics of the project. So they determined, though, that the land between Medicine Hat and Calgary really was not fit for settlement, and were reluctant to accept it. But as I said, Pierce urged them that irrigation would make that land suitable for settlement. And of course, the CPR were very interested in increasing the use of the railway because the settlement hadn't been that successful on this dry land. So more people, more passengers, more freight, and more profits. So the directors of the CPR immediately reopened negotiations with the federal government for the transfer of lands within the Bow River area. So the CPR received an en-bloc transfer of more land, so they would not have to negotiate digging canals and laterals over private property. And as we said, Pierce was now hired by the CPR. So what happened was Dennis and CPR both left the Department of the Interior and went to work for the CPR. Pierce was hired in 1904 to work with Mr. Dennis. And as we said, surveys had to be done of all of this land. So it was seen that in the area that we're interested in, which is near Calgary, gravity irrigation was feasible using the Bow River water to run out to Kinnevie west of Brooks. There was a drop of 305 meters, so it was possible to do irrigation. Land was fertile, sandy, and arid, of course, with no trees. So it would be easy to just build the irrigation canals wherever it was possible to have that ability to run the water from the Bow River out to the farmlands that were dry. So in 1903, the land was divided into 3 irrigation blocks by the Canadian Pacific Railway. They had the Western Block, the Central Block, and the Eastern Block. So this is a map from 1906, a Canadian Pacific Railway map showing the land that was given to the CPR en bloc. So we have the western section, the central section, and the eastern section. In actuality, only the western and eastern sections were completed. And you can see Calgary over on the left, the little dark block. And you can see the canal, the main canal, leaving Calgary, going south and then north to the bottom of Chestermere Lake. You can see the Canal A leaving Chestermere Lake toward the right and going south and then north up towards, eventually down towards Brooks and Kinnevie. And then you can see the canals leaving the north end of Chestermere Lake, the B and C canals delivering water up into that northeast area. So this would be, if they completed all 3 blocks, the largest irrigation project yet in North America. And they decided to develop the western section first. The main office for this was in Calgary with the CPR Department of Natural Resources. And as I said, J.S. Dennis was put in charge, the visionary and friend of Pierce, and then he had Mr. Pierce working under him. The Western Bloc offices, though, were done in Strathmore, along with a demonstration farm, because, of course, farmers would have to learn about irrigation, how it works, how to do it, and the results of the irrigation. And it was the results of the irrigation that the CPR wanted to make sure they proved to these farmers by showing them what could be done. So in 1904, construction was begun on this project. So they dug the main canal from the Bow River. They had to create reservoir number 1, which ended up being Kinneberg Slough and Chestermere Lake. They had to build a dam or berm at the end of the lake. And then they had to build a diversion weir on the Bow River in Calgary to run the water out to the canal. And when I talked about the demonstration farm, Glenbow Museum has many pictures of the actual farm with the barns and the other buildings. But I think the interesting photographs are the ones that they took to show how valuable irrigation could be. So here we have a headless man holding alfalfa up to see how tall, showing how tall it is. I think it's over 3 feet. And then a little girl sitting beside some unirrigated alfalfa. There are also pictures of wheelbarrow loads of cauliflowers, and they also had a prize-winning Hereford farm there. And much of the food from this demonstration farm eventually was used by the CPR to feed the passengers who traveled along the railway. So they had to build the weir. So what was the weir? Well, the weir would divert water from the Bow River by raising the level of the river and then causing that raised water to be diverted down the main canal. The main canal goes south from approximately where Pierce Estate Park is, because that's where the weir is, very near where Pierce's Bow Bend shack was. And that canal leaves there and runs south within the city of Calgary, roughly following the CPR line out of Calgary at about 100th Avenue Southeast. There is a total of 28 kilometers of that main canal from Calgary to Chestermere. And thinking in a bigger picture, about 2,000 kilometers total of canals that go out 160 kilometers out towards Kinnevie. So how did they do this building? Well, this is a photograph of a steam shovel being used to build the main canal. This photograph says it was 10 miles along the main canal, which would be about 16 kilometers, roughly halfway from the weir to Chestermere. And from the weir and Harvey Passage and where Bow Bend Shack was, that area out to Chestermere. And you can see that they really would have a lot of dirt from that canal digging, and it's expected that maybe that dirt was used to build the berm that became the dam at the south end. So we know how they dug the main canal and the larger of the laterals, but there was also a lot of work to be done by men and horses, not just the steam shovels. So this is a photograph of a Fresno, invented in Fresno, California by a man named Porteous. And a lot of the leveling of the ground and smaller work was done with teams of horses and men with this machine. Chestermere Historical Foundation owns one of these, and it is on display just north of the library along the pathway. So this particular one belonged to Miss Barbara Moody, whose family lived in the Chestermere area. Their farmhouse is now on T&T Storage on 17th Avenue Southeast. You can see that farm. So when I interviewed Miss Moody in 1980, and she brought out this Fresno for me to photograph, she said that her father had used this when he'd worked on building the Chestermere Dam. So the Flow Beyond the Weir reference book on the history of the WID states that at peak construction, they would have had 450 men and 400 teams of horses going out to do the work. And how this machine would work is horses were hooked up to the bar at the front, a team, and a man would stand at the back holding on to that handle. As the team moved forward, the driver would tip his handle up and the blade would dig into the earth. The dirt would then fill the Fresno and he would stop the filling by pushing the handle down, at which point the blade would rise up. Then the horses would pull the earth to where it was going to be dumped, and when that time came, the man would flip the handle up and the earth would then dump out of the main body of the Fresno. So it's kind of interesting to think that with steam shovels and this kind of equipment, that from about 1904 to 1907, they completed most of this system. And at that time, water was delivered down Canal A. That's the canal that leaves the southeast corner of Chestermere Lake. Quite amazing when you think about that. So building the berm. So this is a photograph of the berm or dam that was built at the south end of Kinniburgh Slough. And this is an early photograph, we believe, likely around 1904. It was provided by Eileen McElroy, who got it from the Library and Archives Canada. And the photograph is taken approximately where you would be at the end of the blue walking bridge that crosses the canal at the south end of West Chestermere Drive, looking east. And you can see in the corner up on the left there, just below the horizon, what is probably the headworks of the A Canal leaving the southeast corner of the lake. And you can see the steep slope of the berm, and you can also see that there's no weeds growing on it, so that's why we think it was probably about 1904. In 1921, the berm was repaired, and it was adjusted to have a slope of 2 to 1. They put on a foot of gravel and also new riprap, and those would be the larger rocks that you see they're starting to line the wall of the dam with in the middle of the photograph. So it's believed that some of this rock, according to some of the records in the Glenbow in Mr. Stockton's materials, which were donated, and he was in charge of the Strathmore office, and it was reported by Frank Gillam, who worked for him, that some of that rock actually came from the Frank Slide. So let's look at what that actually looked like. So this is a photograph from above looking down at the diversion weir and the main canal in approximately 1922. So the Bow Bend Shack you can probably see over on the left at the end of the row of trees just below the city of Calgary on the horizon, and that's where the bow bends around, and that's where that house was located. And so the diversion weir was built across the Bow River. The lower part that you can see in the photograph backed up the water and caused it to tumble over a structure that was underwater, creating great turbulence, and that's why it was so very dangerous for people to get anywhere near it. And then the part nearer, that's taller, contained 2 wide areas that could be opened or shut. When they were shut, the river would be totally backed up, and then the head gates would be opened on the main canal, which we see coming out to the left, into the left of the photograph. So there were headworks for the main canal and also this other structure that would raise the level to send the water down the main canal. So much like what happens now, during the winter time, the higher area would be totally open so the water could run through, and the head gates would be shut so no water would come down the canal. And that usually, that closure usually happens October 1st, and then the structure starts sending water down the main canal about May 1st, when the farmers are going to start using it for haying and for their crops. So the dam, we showed pictures of the dam, and of course they needed a balancing pond for the system back then, because they certainly didn't have the sophisticated methods for controlling the levels of the water. So what the balancing pond or Chestermere Lake served was to make sure that there was always water for the farmers to have at any one time. So Kinniburgh Slough was chosen as that balancing pond. It was at that time an intermittent lake and part of a natural land depression and a wetlands that traveled probably from Shepherd way north of Chestermere. Mr. Kinniburgh actually farmed west of the existing lake. So it was stated by a man whom I interviewed, Ernie Moore, back in the 1980s, that there actually had been canoeing from Shepherd to Chestermere in the wet years. So we know that there was quite a bit of water in that area, with the Kinniburgh Slough being the largest and deepest of those wet areas. And of course, we know that the Shepherd wetlands are south of Chestermere, as is Ralph Klein Park. And if you've visited Ralph Klein Park, you can see that it was built in a very large wetland. So the dam is 2,000 feet long, or 0.6 kilometers, and 30 feet high, or 9.1 meters. The lake that it formed is about 3 miles, or 4.8 kilometers long, and a half mile, or 0.8 kilometers wide. The lake was not dredged, but people kept saying, well, the lake was dredged, but Kay, Clark, and I decided that this idea had probably come from all the work that was done to build the berm, because they would have had to do a lot of earth moving to do that. So this is a really interesting map that was created by Ray Blanchard, who's a member of the Historical Foundation. He took a 2020 map of Chestermere and superimposed it on an 1898 Department of the Interior Irrigation Surveys map that was created by G.S. Roy, a surveyor at that time, showing where Kinniburgh Slough would be related to Chestermere Lake. So that greeny yellow part is Kinniburgh Slough. So you can see why the fishermen in the wintertime like to fish on that side of the lake. It's probably the deeper part. And next, we have a blueprint for Reservoir 1, which was from the files of the CPR at the Glenbow. And I have an orange arrow there pointing to the exit area where Canal A would leave the southeast corner, just to orient you. The orange arrow would be over where Kinniburgh is approximately. You can see above that arrow a hatched area that would be the berm that was built. And then you can also see where the main canal then exits. However, at that time, there was probably a creek and some other wetlands just to the west of the edge of that berm. But you can see where the water would come running in. So they made use of creeks, of course, wherever they could in building the canals and laterals of the system. So let's look at the other end of the berm. So this would be standing just at the far east end of the berm on the edge of Canal A that exits in the southeast, looking at the headworks of Canal A, which we saw previously when we were looking east from the west end of the berm. So this photograph we think is also about 1904. Maybe a little bit later, because you can see there are weeds growing on the earth that was used to create the edges of Canal A, and you can actually see a little A on the construction there of the head gates. And this photograph also came from Library and Archives Canada. Thank you to Eileen McElroy for that. And you can see that there was nothing out there. It was bald, bare prairie. So right now we can imagine all the houses that are along West Chestermere Drive. There's nothing there in this photograph. So who looked after this structure? Well, they hired ditch riders for each of the areas where designated for irrigation, and there was a ditch rider for Chestermere Lake. And this is a photograph of the second house that was built for the ditch riders. This is a photograph from November 5th, 1918, and it's likely Mr. Ted Staves, who was the ditch rider at that time, standing on the porch of the house. So the ditch rider would divert water when the farmers called for it, and they also rode along the ditches to make sure that they were in good order, that nothing was wrong. The walls of the ditches were patent, and there were no vermin such as badgers digging holes that would cause interruption of the flow. Likely wood and things like that would get caught up had to be removed. And you can read stories about these men, at least the ones who worked for the system up to 1944. The stories were written by Eileen McElroy with help from Kay Clark and are on our web page under Who and What is a Ditch Rider. So I encourage you to go there and read some of these very interesting stories of the interesting jobs these men had and all the variety of things they got involved in. And then Chestermere becomes a destination, not long after it's finished. And how did it get its name? Well, it's believed it's either from people from Chestermere, Chesterville, Ontario, picnicking near where Camp Chestermere is now, or from a Lord Chestermere who was a CPR director. And as we saw, historically, often places were named after people acquainted with the people who discovered it or worked there. So that could be that it was a CPR director. Also, Chester is from the Latin meaning camp, and mere from the Old English meaning lake. And it is known that the Indigenous people traveled by here on what was called the Blackfoot Trail, coming from the south north towards Calgary and the mountains. And an Indigenous stone hammer was found on the west shore of Chestermere Lake, so it could be that this would have been an Indigenous camping spot. This is an old photograph from the early days of Chestermere as a destination for people to go for coolness and pleasure in the hot summer days, and it is taken from approximately where the landing is, looking west. You can see the old cars and people gathered on the beach in a boat out there. We think this might be around 1906. And also a newer story that is of interest that was told to me from 1966, someone who also discovered Chestermere. Marilyn Feigs was at a presentation I did, and she shared this memory. In 1966, she was taken on a blind date, invited to go out to Chestermere Lake. And thinking that this was like Lake Louise, she dressed in her finest, including high heels and her best dress. And she said she'll never forget how embarrassed she was traipsing around through the mud in those lovely shoes of hers on that date out to Chestermere Lake. And that concludes the presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can keep in touch and also send us messages on our webpage at chestermerehistoricalfoundation.org or on Facebook, where we post our events when we're holding programs such as this and other, hopefully in the future, live events as well as online presentations. You can find us on Twitter, and we meet monthly for a meeting and a program, so you can watch for announcements on any of the above platforms. And the photograph that I used for the first slide, which is repeated again here, was one from 1910. One of the developers who had planned Calgary's summer resort of Chestermere Heights created this little map. You can see a line going from the city directly towards Chestermere with a little bend. That was going to be a suburban railway, and you can see the little train on the railway. And then along the east shore of Chestermere, you can see houses, and you can see the pointy roof of what was going to be the Chestermere Aquatic Center. So from 1910, this never happened for sure. In those days, there was a boom in that time in Alberta and around Calgary, but it went bust. And it took over 100 years for Chestermere to actually be a wonderful place and summer resort. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I have a bibliography of where the information came from, and that will be provided on the website as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time and attention and interest in the history of Chestermere. Thank you.